I'm KM Best. Jean Grey just dropped in Marvel Snap. I have been having success with her in a Thanos list. I'd like to break down that deck for you and also talk about some of the issues with her release. So this is the Thanos slash Jean Grey list that I have been playing. It is a very successful lockdown control deck that looks to win multiple lanes by being a combination zoo and scam deck. So you're going to be dictating what your opponent is able to do with cards like Jean Grey and Professor X, and you're also going to be invalidating some of their plays with cards like Valkyrie, and you'll notice an ongoing sub-theme in the deck, allowing us to capitalize on Spectrum, Khazar, and Blue Marvel in order to add power into what may seem like closed-off locations. Ant-Man is a key card in the deck. It's an ongoing ability with an extremely high power level for the cost if you manage to hit his condition. In addition, Ant-Man in a Valkyrie lane will win it as long as Valkyrie is the last card to go off. Even if your opponent has a full Valkyrie lane, you will get the extra power from the Ant-Man as well and win that Valkyrie lane. Ghost might seem to be a little bit weird. It's not a card that sees a ton of play, but it fulfills three main things in this deck list. First, it's ongoing, so it has synergy with Spectrum. Second, it costs 1, so it has synergy with Khazar. Third, it allows you to make sure that your Valkyrie is always going to be the last card that flips up. This is very important. Generally speaking, there are a lot of decks in the metagame that are very good at throwing priority to you. You want to make those decks have to answer the ghost, or their big units will end up getting invalidated by Valkyrie. Luke Cage is another way to break Valkyrie symmetry. You might think this card is in here for High Evolutionary or other Thanoses with Soulstone. It's actually here so that your cards under the Valkyrie lane won't actually shrink. This is pretty slick. Now, there's not a lot of cards in the deck that this is going to always impact, but it is a genuinely useful thing to keep in mind. By the same token, if your opponent has a Luke Cage, your Valkyrie is not going to do anything, so do keep that in mind as well. Armor is more in this deck as an answer to Killmonger than as a proactive tool against Destroy decks, but obviously, she can fit both roles. Mostly, she's an answer to Killmonger, which you definitely need, because of the reliance on one-cost cards in this list. And because, if you're Valkyrying something and your whole Valkyrie lane is one-cost cards that get blown up by a Killmonger, your plan kind of falls apart. You are, at core, something of a zoo list. You do need to have answers to Killmonger, and with armor, with Professor X, you can usually get a decent amount of your one-cost cards protected. Jeff might look a little odd here, but between Jean and Professor X and locations that close you out, there are a lot of roles that Jeff plays here. You're actually not very good at getting onto locations that lock you out, places like Sanctum Sanctorum without Jeff. And interestingly enough, with the buffs that we can give Jeff, it's not the end of the world if we reach one of those locations. After all, a Doombot is only 4 power now. Jeff and Blue Marvel is 4. You can play for a tiebreaker from there. It's not perfect, but it is a useful tool for this deck to have. Jean Grey, I really do think adds something special to this deck, because as a Thanos list, you are very able a lot of the time to just play cards in the Jean Grey lane, put a stone in there, and then, play off the Jean Grey lane, and your opponent might not be as able to do that as consistently as you. In addition, Jean Grey makes sure that there are full lanes of stuff for you to hit with Valkyrie. So you get a Soulstone in the Jean Grey lane, and then your final turn is the Valkyrie in the Jean Grey lane. You invalidated a lot of plays from your opponent when you do that. Khazar buffs one-cost cards, and we run about 8 of them if you count all the stones as well as the one-costs that we actually run. Khazar is a way to get power into closed-off locations, and a lot of the time with this deck, you're going to close off locations. And so you need a way to sort of back buff those locations in unexpected ways. Khazar is pretty reasonable for that. At only 4 cost, he is often going to be very valuable. Blue Marvel is just great in this deck, but the 5 cost slot is a bit tough for you to manage, especially if you're trying to do Jean stuff, which requires you to play a 1 plus a 5, it gets a little tough to actually play him out. But when you get him on the board, I mean, you are very often going to have a full board with this deck, and Blue Marvel is very often going to be extremely impactful on those full boards. The Scam King himself, Professor X, but with all of the ways that we have to sort of back buff Professor X lanes, we have Jeff, we have Khazar if there are 1 costs in there, we have Blue Marvel, we have Spectrum, we have so many different ways to back buff Professor X lanes, and that means that you can play this guy with impunity a lot of the time. There are a lot of Time Stone into YOLO Professor X plays, or if you have Jean, there's actually some interesting stuff where you go Time Stone on 4, and then on 5 you go Stone plus X because they're very likely going to be forced to play something into the Jean lane. There's a lot of cool stuff that you can get done with this guy. I think he is one of the most important cards in the deck, and if you don't have this scam backup plan, you are not really doing much other than being a zoo deck. So I do think that the scam part of this is very, very important. Valkyrie is your other major scam. With Luke Cage on the board, or with a Soul Stone in her lane, or with an Ant-Man in her lane, you are going to win a lane with this card. That's what she does. She wins lanes. You have a lot of ways to break her symmetrical effect, and there are a lot of decks that put a lot of power in one lane. You do have to keep an eye out for ongoing effects. You know, sometimes you do have to do some Hulk math, because Hulk is still getting a pretty decent amount of power, even if you reduce him to 3 base instead of 12 base. So you do have to consider that a decent amount, but you like, between Blue Marvel, Khazar, Soulstone, Ant-Man, there are tons of ways to break Valkyrie symmetry in this deck, and you are going to be doing it very often. I would say that she is one of, if not the best card in this entire deck. It's an important thing as well to note that Ghost, making sure that Valkyrie goes last, is genuinely, like, you have to do that. It's actually incredibly, incredibly important, and I really do think it is a key factor here. Spectrum is a card I'm very unsure about in here. I don't play her a lot. Sometimes I think maybe I should replace her for something that does similar stuff on a smaller scale. I think that card might be like Mr. Fantastic or something along those lines. Another way to sort of back buff Professor X lanes, to make sure your Valkyrie lanes are winning. I think you could talk me into just running a Mr. Fantastic over the Spectrum. I am running the Spectrum because so many of the cards in this deck are ongoing, and you will be able to get a pretty decent amount of power output out of her, and I tend to default towards saying, you know, like, sometimes I just want the power output. So you do have to keep in mind, of course, that both Power Stone and Soul Stone are also ongoing cards, and so when you keep that in mind, like, there are just a very, very, very large amount of ongoing cards in this deck. Spectrum's a little bit of a free roll. If you want to try Mr. Fantastic, I don't blame you. I do think the 6 cost spot is, whether we should be running 6 cost cards is genuinely up for debate. Except for this one. This 6 cost card, I think, is probably non-negotiable. Thanos is the engine that makes the deck run. I think everyone should be familiar with this card at this point, and Thanos putting the Infinity Stones in your deck, allowing you to weave them in, get beneficial effects. They're units on the board that get buffed by Khazar. They're units on the board that get buffed by Blue Marvel. They fill up your lanes so that your Valkyries are better than your opponents. Soulstone is a great way to break symmetry with Valkyrie. There's just so many things that these stones do, and, like, I can't even tell you which one is the best one. The 2 that stick out in this deck, I would say, are Time Stone and Soul Stone. But, of course, Mind Stone is the one you want to be drawing on 1, because drawing 2 cards is ridiculous. But, you know, Time Stone into early Professor X, extremely powerful. Soul Stone, breaking the symmetry with Valkyrie, extremely powerful. There's just a lot that these cards get done for you, and I think Thanos is a key component of this archetype. So that is where I'm at with Jean Grey so far, but I do think that outside of just talking about this list, I do want to address some of the bugs that the card has demonstrated. So there seem to be 3 major categories of Jean Grey bugs. The first is that there doesn't seem to be anything that can actually stop her effect from happening. She gets Enchantress, it doesn't do anything. She gets turned into a symbiote in Clintar, it doesn't do anything. She gets Spider-Hammed, it doesn't do anything. Her ability stays there no matter what. She gets turned into the Hulk on Gamma Lab, she's still doing her ability. So that's the first very clear, I think, bug with Jean Grey that you have to keep in mind when you play a deck like this. Second, when Jean Grey is face down via either Daredevil or Lemuria, her effect is still in place, which means your opponent has to play on her lane, which is a really remarkable thing, and I really do hope they fix that one. It's very odd. I really don't have a good read on why that's happening, but that is a very clear bug for me. Third, based on my reading of Jean Grey, I assumed that if you had Goose and Jean in the same lane and were unable to play cards into that lane, you would be able to play cards elsewhere because of the way Jean is worded. She says, of course, if possible. But it doesn't seem like that's true right now. And so that is, I would say, probably the third type of bug that you can see with Jean Grey. If you don't have anything that you can play into a Goose lane and a Jean Grey is in a Goose lane, you just can't play cards. So do keep that one in mind as well. By the same token, I have thought about running Goose in the deck that we just showed, but I don't actually know what I would cut for it, and I think cutting yourself off of Valkyrie is like weirdly damaging, but maybe I'm just underrating how disruptive Goose and Jean can be when we are a deck full of ones. So I think if you want to try Goose, I would say the cut is probably Jeff. If you want to try Goose in this list to go get some advantage out of the Goose plus Jean combo, or say to just play Goose in a deck that already benefits from it, that already is running a lot of ongoing synergy, that already locks down a lot of lanes. I think you can try Goose in here. I think it would be pretty reasonable. To wrap up, I first want to say thank you. I appreciate anyone who watched this far. It really does mean a lot. Thank you so much. Please remember, like and subscribe, all those things. But I did want to get your thoughts in the comments on Jean Grey and this release, because I know it's contentious, right? A card releases in what seems to be a clearly bugged state, and I don't think it's the first time. In fact, I think it's a little harder to name a card that didn't release in a little bit of a bugged state than a card that did. And so I do wonder, I guess I just want your thoughts on Jean Grey generally, on how you think these potential bugs impact her playability, on whether or not you plan on buying her. I will say, I know a lot of people have been comparing her to Kitty Pryde. I don't think that's a very good comparison, because Kitty Pryde was the kind of game breaking where it literally broke the game for 30 minutes every, like, I don't know, 10th time it was played or something, and it was designed to be replayed. So I think Kitty Pryde was like a significant amount more game breaking. And so if you're someone who would want to buy Jean and be like, oh, I'm going to buy Jean and get compensation for it, I'm investing in Jean, stonks, I think maybe that might not be a good idea. It could pay off for you. Hey, what do I know? But I don't think it's to the same degree as Kitty Pryde. So I do want to pour a little bit of cold water on that fire. I'm not sure it's a good idea to invest in this card as an investment opportunity, looking to double your tokens or whatever. That said, I do really want to know what y'all think about the bugs with Jean Grey, because I personally would say I'm a little disappointed with how the state of the card as it released. I think the card is pretty cool, and I'm sort of annoyed that, you know, this is what we're talking about, right? I'd like to not have this section on my video. You know what I mean? I would like to just talk about the deck I made and how fun it is, but instead I've got to talk about like the 3 categories of bugs that Jean Grey has. So that's kind of where I'm at. I'd like to know where you're at. Thanks for watching. As always, I've been Cam Best. I will see you in the next one. Have a good one.